Taxes are an integral part of human history, as old as civilization itself. Ever since humans began to live in organized societies, there have been those who governed these societies, and thus a need for resources to maintain order, defend, or build. From the ancient Sumerian city-states collecting tribute in grain to today's global economies with their complex tax systems, the principle has remained the same. A portion of the wealth of citizens is transferred to the state treasury. But while today we are accustomed to income taxes, value-added taxes, or excise duties on fuel, history is replete with far more unusual and sometimes bizarre ways to fill the treasury. These fiscal inventions did more than simply raise money. They often reflected social norms, economic needs, cultural prejudices, or even the personal whims of rulers. Some were introduced out of desperation, others to change the behavior of the population, and still others as a way to combat social problems. So I invite you to embark on a fascinating journey through time and continents to explore the most bizarre and sometimes ridiculous taxes that have ever existed. We will see how taxes on windows forced people to wall up the source of light, how taxes on salt led to riots, and how even a beard could become an object of taxation. These historical examples will not only entertain us with their eccentricity, but also show how fiscal policy influenced everyday life, architecture, fashion, and even health. And we will start with taxes that affected everyday life and fashion. We will dive into the world of taxes that not only filled the state treasury, but also radically changed everyday life, habits, and even the appearance of people. These taxes were often aimed at visible objects or easily accountable aspects of everyday life, but their consequences turned out to be much deeper than just financial costs. Let's start with one of the best-known and perhaps most visually striking examples of an unusual tax: the window tax in England. First introduced in 1696 under King William III, it was intended to be a simple and effective replacement for the unpopular poll tax. The idea seemed logical. The more windows a house had, the larger and more expensive it was likely to be, meaning its owner was richer and able to pay more taxes. So it was a kind of property tax disguised as the number of windows. You're probably wondering how it all worked. In reality, the system was relatively simple. Each home was charged a fixed base fee, and then an additional amount was added for each window over a certain number. Initially, the tax started at 10 windows. If you had 10 to 20 windows, you paid one rate, and if you had more than 20, you paid a higher rate. Over time, the thresholds and rates changed, but the principle remained the same. The more light that entered your home, the more money left your wallet. The tax was collected by inspectors who went from house to house counting windows. The main reason for such a tax was, as always, financial. After the 9 Years' War, England was in dire need of funds to replenish the state treasury. The per capita tax, which had been tried before, had proven extremely unpopular and difficult to collect. The window tax, on the contrary, seemed easy to administer. Windows were difficult to hide, and their number was easy to count. In addition, it seemed relatively fair, since it was indirectly linked to the level of wealth. But the effects of the window tax were far more serious and long-lasting than just filling the treasury. It literally changed the face of English towns and villages. The most immediate and dramatic effect was the widespread bricking up of windows. To avoid paying extra tax, homeowners, especially those who could not afford the high tax burden, began to brick up their windows. Empty apertures, traces of walled-up windows can still be seen on old English buildings. This has become a kind of architectural scar, a reminder of the fiscal policy of the past. Some architects even talk about the appearance of blind or false windows, which only imitated the presence of windows for the symmetry of the facade, but were in fact walled up from the inside. Also began to design houses with fewer windows or to arrange them in such a way as to minimize the tax burden. This led to a change in traditional layouts and the emergence of darker interiors. New buildings often had fewer windows than they could have, and older ones were remodeled to save money. It is worth remembering that the window tax had a much more sinister effect: its impact on public health. Less light and fresh air in homes contributed to the spread of diseases, especially respiratory infections and tuberculosis. In urban slums, where unsanitary conditions already reigned, walled-up windows only made the situation worse, creating ideal conditions for the reproduction of microbes. Doctors and public figures of the time actively opposed the tax, pointing out its negative impact on health. And despite the relative ease of collection, the tax was extremely unpopular. It was called the air and light tax and was considered unfair, especially for the poor, who were forced to sacrifice comfort and health for the sake of economy. Proverbs and jokes arose, ridiculing the absurdity of this tax. Public discontent grew over the decades. Despite its unpopularity and obvious negative consequences, the window tax lasted for a full 156 years. It was only abolished in 1851, when it was replaced by a more modern and less harmful property tax. The abolition was the result of long debates and campaigns by doctors, health reformers, and social activists, who were finally able to prove to Parliament its detrimental impact on the health and well-being of the nation. By that time, Great Britain had already entered the era of industrialization, and old, ineffective methods of tax collection were giving way to more rational ones. The history of the window tax is a vivid example of how a seemingly simple and logical fiscal instrument can lead to completely unforeseen and even harmful consequences for society, changing not only the economy, but also the very fabric of everyday life and the appearance of cities. Well, after the so-called light tax, let's move on to another example demonstrating how the state tried to tax not only real estate, but also elements of fashion and personal style. In 1784, a tax on hats was introduced in Great Britain. At first glance, this seems absurd, but for that time it was a completely logical continuation of the idea of taxing luxury items, or at least those things that could indicate the wealth of the owner. Hats were an essential part of the wardrobe of both men and women, and often their cost was directly proportional to the social status and wealth of the person. As with the window tax, the main reason for this tax was financial necessity. The late 18th century was a time of significant military expenditure for Britain, including the American Revolutionary War, which was very costly for the Treasury. The government of Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger needed new sources of income. The hat tax was seen as a way to raise funds from the wealthy classes who could afford expensive headwear. It was relatively easy to administer compared to other types of taxes and promised to bring in a steady income, and the mechanism for collecting the tax was quite ingenious. All hats intended for sale had to have a special excise stamp. In simple terms, a stamp that indicated that the tax had been paid. The tax rate depended on the value of the hat. For example, cheaper hats were taxed less, while expensive ones were taxed more. Sellers who sold hats without the appropriate stamp were subject to fines. Moreover, anyone selling hats had to obtain a special license from the tax office, which also cost money. This created a dual system of control, at the level of the manufacturer or importer of the brand, and at the level of the seller, the license. Although the hat tax did not cause such dramatic architectural changes as the window tax, it did affect the market and consumer behavior. For example, as is often the case with taxes on specific goods, people looked for ways to save money. Some sellers tried to sell hats without stamps, which led to an increase in smuggling. Buyers might prefer cheaper hats or try to wear old hats longer. There were rumors that people declared various other items hats to avoid paying the tax, although this is difficult to verify. However, the main trick was to ensure that hats that had already been used were not taxed. The tax certainly had an impact on the hat industry. It may have slowed sales of expensive hats and encouraged the production of cheaper models. It may also have encouraged the development of a black market or underground hat industry, although the extent of this is difficult to estimate. Although not as hated as the window tax or the salt tax, the tax was still resented. It was seen as another example of the government trying to get into the pockets of citizens. However, unlike the window tax, it was not associated with such serious health or housing problems, so public outcry was less pronounced. In the end, the hat tax did not last as long as the window tax, only 27 years. It was repealed in 1811. The reasons for its repeal were probably related to its ineffectiveness in raising large sums of money. It never raised as much as expected, and administrative difficulties. This is how the history of the hat tax shows that even the most seemingly innocuous items of everyday clothing could become the object of taxation, demonstrating the desire of states to find new sources of income and possibly influence the consumer behavior of their citizens. And now we move on to the second unusual tax, which was on food and resources. Now we will look at taxes that affected vital food and resources. Such taxes, although they might seem like an effective way to fill the treasury, often caused the strongest discontent among the population, since they directly affected survival and could lead to hunger and social upheaval. One of the most famous and perhaps most hated taxes in French history was the gabelle, or salt tax. It existed from the 14th century until the French Revolution, becoming one of the key factors that pushed the people to revolt. The importance of salt in those days is hard to overestimate. Before the invention of refrigerators, it was the only effective way to preserve products such as meat and fish, and was also used in agriculture, tanning, and medicine. Thus, salt was not a luxury, but a vital necessity. The gabelle was created when the French kings, embroiled in the 100 Years' War, were in desperate need of funds. Initially, it was a temporary levy, but over time it became a permanent and comprehensive tax. The main reason for the introduction of the gabelle was, of course, financial. Salt was a mass-market product that could not be dispensed with. This guaranteed huge revenues for the treasury. In addition, the state received a monopoly on the sale of salt. This meant that peasants could not simply evaporate salt from seawater or extract it from salt springs without permission and paying a tax. Indeed, the gabelle system was complex and unfair. France was divided into several gabelle zones, and each of them had its own rules and rates, which could differ significantly. And the first such zone was the Grand Gabelle, where salt was sold only by the state, and the population was obliged to buy a certain minimum amount of salt per year at a very high price, regardless of real need. This was called compulsory purchase. The second was Small Gabelle. In these regions, salt was also a state monopoly, but there was no mandatory purchase. There were also free salt zones. In some regions, especially those where salt was mined in large quantities, gabelle was not used, and salt was significantly cheaper. And finally, there were salt barns. These were state warehouses where salt was brought and where it was sold to the population. These barns were under strict control, and any trade in salt outside of them was considered a crime. Such differences in prices and regulations between regions created enormous opportunities for smuggling. But the consequences of the gabelle for French society were catastrophic and became one of the main reasons for the mass discontent that resulted in the revolution. The gabelle was indeed universally hated. For the poor, who depended on salt to preserve their meager food supplies, the tax was an unbearable burden. The price of salt could be dozens of times higher than the cost price. Compulsory purchase meant that even those who did not need so much salt were forced to buy it, taking away the last money from other vital needs. The price differences between regions created a thriving black market. Thousands of people, known as salt counterfeiters or salt smugglers, risked their lives smuggling salt from low-price areas to high-price areas. The penalties for smuggling were extremely severe: imprisonment, the galleys, hard labor on ships, and even the death penalty. Every year, thousands of people were arrested and punished for salt-related crimes. This created enormous social tension and a sense of injustice. Also, discontent with the gabelle constantly fueled social unrest. It became a symbol of the despotism of the old regime, its arbitrariness and injustice. Along with feudal duties and other taxes, the gabelle was one of the first taxes that was abolished by the revolutionary government in 1790, which was met with stormy applause and became one of the first steps towards building a new society. And the gabelle was finally abolished in 1790 by the French National Assembly, shortly after the outbreak of the French Revolution. Its abolition was one of the first and most popular decrees of the revolutionary government, symbolizing a break with the unfair tax system of the old regime. Indeed, the history of the gabelle is a powerful reminder of how a tax on a vital resource can become a catalyst for social upheaval and a symbol of oppression. After the salt tax, which literally sucked the life out of the population, we move on to an example of a tax that had a completely different purpose. Not so much to raise money, but to change agricultural habits and ensure food security. We are talking about the potato tax, which was introduced in parts of Prussia in the 18th century, especially under King Frederick the Great. Potatoes introduced to Europe from America were long viewed with suspicion. They were considered cattle food, poisonous, or conducive to disease. In some regions, there were even bans on their cultivation. However, in the 18th century, when Europe was experiencing frequent crop failures and famines, enlightened monarchs such as Frederick II of Prussia recognized the potential of the potato as a crop that could feed the population. Potatoes are easy to grow, produce large yields, and are rich in nutrients. In fact, Frederick the Great was obsessed with making Prussia self-sufficient in food. He actively promoted potato growing, issued potato decrees, and even held potato parades to set an example for the population. However, when persuasion did not work, more radical measures were used. In some regions, a fine was introduced, which can be seen as a kind of negative tax for those peasants who did not grow potatoes in a certain amount or on a certain area. This was, in fact, a tax for not growing this new, but potentially life-saving root crop. Instead of collecting money for potatoes grown, the aim was to force them to grow them. Peasants were ordered to set aside a portion of their land for potatoes. If they did not, or if their harvest was insufficient, they could be fined or otherwise punished. Frederick II personally enforced his decrees, sometimes even ordering his soldiers to guard potato fields, so that the peasants, seeing their value, would begin to grow them. It is worth mentioning that Frederick II's policies, including these potato taxes, led to the gradual, if reluctant, acceptance of the potato in Prussia. It is obvious that at first the peasants resisted. They did not trust the new product, considering it tasteless or even dangerous. The pressure to grow it caused discontent. However, as people became convinced of the high yield of potatoes and their ability to prevent famine, especially in lean years, their popularity grew. By the end of the 18th century, potatoes had become a staple food in Prussia and throughout Europe, saving millions of lives. It must be said that the tax on potatoes, in fact, became part of a state program to change agricultural practices and modernize agriculture. This is an example of how fiscal instruments can be used not only to collect funds, but also to stimulate desired social or economic behavior. For us, the history of the Prussian potato tax is a unique example, when fiscal policy was used not to confiscate, but to force production, ultimately saving entire nations from starvation and forever changing their diet. Of unusual taxes, namely taxes on unusual objects and phenomena. They taxed what is hard to imagine as a source of income, be it physiological processes, appearance, or even building materials. These examples clearly demonstrate the ingenuity and sometimes desperation of states in search of new ways to replenish the treasury. Perhaps one of the most unusual and even shocking taxes for a modern person is the urine tax, introduced by the Roman Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century AD. If the window tax affected architecture and the salt tax affected food, then the urine tax affected a very delicate but important aspect of the daily life of the Romans. Urine in ancient Rome, as in other ancient societies, had many more practical uses than just waste. Due to its ammonia content, it was a valuable raw material for various industries. The Romans used urine in a variety of areas, for example, for bleaching and cleaning woolen fabrics. Ammonia copes well with grease and dirt, making the fabric softer and cleaner. For processing and tanning leather, making it soft and pliable. Also for dyeing fabrics, and sometimes for cleaning teeth. Although it sounds crazy to us, ammonia does have some antiseptic properties. Public toilets, as well as private urine collectors, were common in Rome as they supplied artisans with this valuable raw material. The Roman Empire was in serious financial trouble during the time of Vespasian, largely due to the wasteful policies of his predecessors. Vespasian was known as a pragmatic and thrifty ruler who did not hesitate to introduce even the most unusual taxes if they could bring in revenue. It was he who introduced the urinal tax, a tax on collecting urine in public toilets. The essence of the tax was that those who collected urine for sale, owners of public toilets or collectors, had to pay a certain amount to the state. The most famous episode connected with this tax is described by the Roman historian Suetonius. Vespasian's son Titus expressed his disgust to his father at such a dirty way of earning money. In response, Vespasian took a handful of the coins received from this tax, held them to Titus's nose and asked, "Do you smell it?" Meaning the smell of urine. Titus replied that he did not. To this, Vespasian uttered his famous phrase, "And yet they are of urine," or in the more familiar Latin formulation, "Money does not smell." This phrase has become a catchphrase and is still used today to emphasize that the origin of money does not always matter, as long as it is useful. I suggest we take a closer look at how this system worked. We know that the tax was not collected from the citizens themselves who visited the toilets, but from those who made a profit from collecting and selling urine. These were the owners of public toilets or traders who purchased urine for use in their production. For the state, this was an easy way to tax an already existing profitable trade that had not previously brought direct income to the treasury. Naturally, the tax caused some disgust and ridicule due to its nature. It was the subject of jokes and discontent. But Vespasian, being a tough and decisive ruler, did not pay attention to this if the treasury was replenished. For him, practical benefits were more important than moral or aesthetic prejudices. Thus, the tax existed until his death and was subsequently abolished. But his memory remained in history thanks to the famous phrase, "I can say that the urine tax is not only a funny but also an instructive example of how the state can find income even in the most unexpected and seemingly unclean sources. If there is an urgent financial need and a pragmatic ruler, I propose to consider another tax in this section, namely the beard tax. This is another striking example of how fiscal policy can interfere with the sphere of personal appearance and fashion. Similar taxes or attempts to introduce them existed in different countries, including Europe. For example, in Great Britain in 1798, a tax was introduced on wig powder, which can be indirectly considered as an attempt to influence fashion and perhaps even the wearing of beards. The idea of taxing beards, when it arose in different countries, usually had two main reasons. Firstly, a beard, especially a well-groomed and long one, could be a sign of status or belonging to a certain social class. Taxing it was a way to extract revenue from those who could afford it. Secondly, in some cases, the beard tax was a tool for imposing a certain cultural standard or modernization. For example, the introduction of such a tax could be an attempt to push people toward a more European or modern appearance, abandoning traditional or religious customs associated with wearing a beard. The mechanisms for collecting the beard tax could vary. For example, a person wishing to keep a beard had to pay a certain amount to the treasury. But in some cases, after paying the tax, a special token or receipt was issued, which had to be carried with you as proof of payment. Without such a sign, a person could be forcibly shaved. Of course, the rates could also depend on social status, income, or even the length of the beard. The higher the status or the richer the person, the higher the tax on his beard could be. The beard tax was usually met with considerable resistance and resentment, especially among those for whom wearing a beard was linked to religious beliefs or deep cultural traditions. It was perceived as a direct interference with personal freedom and customs. People might try to avoid paying the tax by shaving or hiding their beards. Despite this, such taxes were a symbol of the ruler's power and his desire to change society as he saw fit. Although in Britain, the direct tax on beards was not as well known as in some other countries, the very concept of taxing elements of personal style, as in the case of a tax on hats or powder, points to similar motives of the state to fill the coffers, and perhaps influence the appearance of its citizens. Well, after urine and beards, let's move on to a seemingly completely neutral object, bricks. However, they also became an object of taxation in Great Britain, which led to very interesting consequences for architecture and the construction industry. The tax on bricks was introduced in the same year, 1784, as the tax on hats, and lasted almost until the middle of the 19th century. Like many other taxes of the period, the brick tax was introduced to fill the government coffers. Britain was in need of funds after various conflicts, including the American Revolutionary War. Bricks were a basic building material, especially in growing cities, and their production was easy to account for. It seemed like a simple and effective way to raise significant funds. The tax was levied not on homeowners, but on brickmakers. The tax was set for every 1,000 bricks produced. The exact rate changed over time, but the principle itself remained unchanged. The more bricks a factory produced, the more tax it had to pay. To control production and payment of the tax, there was a system of inspectors who monitored the volumes of output. The effects of the brick tax were quite curious and had a direct impact on British architecture and building technology. The most direct and logical consequence was that brickmakers began to produce bricks much larger than was customary. Since the tax was levied on the number of bricks per 1,000 and not on their volume or weight, it was logical to make as many as possible. After all, if one large brick could replace 1.5 or 2 small ones, then by using large bricks, builders needed fewer of them to erect the same wall, and the manufacturer accordingly paid less tax for the same cubic capacity of the finished product. This led to the emergence of so-called tax bricks, unusually large for that time, also changed the appearance of buildings. The walls became more massive, and the bricks themselves looked rougher. This also affected the masonry techniques and required adaptation by builders. In addition, the tax may have encouraged the use of other, non-taxable materials, such as stone or wood. Although this was less practical in some regions. Although bricks remained popular, the tax certainly forced the search for more economical construction options, which may have encouraged the development of other building techniques or materials. We know that the brick tax lasted for quite a long time, 66 years to be exact. Its abolition was part of a wider reform of the tax system in Britain, aimed at eliminating outdated and ineffective taxes. By the mid-19th century, industry and construction were demanding a more rational approach, and a tax that distorted the market and production was seen as burdensome. This brief history of the brick tax shows how even taxes on basic industrial goods can have unexpected consequences, influencing the size of products, construction methods, and even the architectural appearance of a country. Well, I suggest moving on and looking at some modern examples of unusual taxes or ideas. Although many of the above taxes seem like relics of the distant past, the idea of using taxes not only to fill the treasury but also to change the behavior of citizens remains relevant. In the modern world, its own unusual taxes appear, which are often aimed at solving social, environmental, or health problems. Or tax concepts are discussed that could become part of the future. And the first such example is worth mentioning was the pet tax, especially on dogs. This is not really a new concept, but it continues to exist in many countries around the world today. It combines a fiscal purpose with regulatory and social functions, and the first goal of such a tax was to replenish the local budget. All collected funds are often used to maintain animal shelters, control the number of homeless animals, clean public areas from dog waste, and create special infrastructure, i.e., walking areas. The tax may also be designed to regulate the number of domestic animals, especially in urban areas, and encourage responsible ownership. Paying the tax is often associated with registering the animal, which helps in case of loss or to track vaccinations. And in some places, the tax on spayed or neutered animals is lower to encourage the practice. Dog owners are usually required to register their animals annually and pay a certain amount of tax. The tax rate may vary depending on size and breed of dog, for example. Large or dangerous breeds may be taxed more. And as already mentioned, for sterilized animals, the tax may be lower. But it is worth saying that the tax can be city or municipal, and its rates vary depending on the region. There are also often exceptions for service dogs, such as guide dogs or police dogs, as well as for animals used in agriculture. It is known that the dog tax is generally accepted with understanding if the funds are used to improve the urban environment and protect animals. However, it can cause discontent among those who consider it an unfair burden or see that the funds collected are used ineffectively. Sometimes it leads to unscrupulous owners refusing to register their animals in order to avoid the fee. I would also like to introduce you to one of the most striking examples of a modern tax aimed at changing the behavior of the population for the public good is the so-called sugar tax, or tax on unhealthy food or drinks. This type of tax has become widespread in recent decades throughout the world. The main purpose of this tax was to reduce the consumption of foods high in sugar, saturated fat and salt, which contribute to obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and other health problems. Also, the collected funds are often used to finance programs to combat obesity, sports initiatives, educational campaigns, or to support the healthcare system in general. Let's see how it all works. The tax is usually levied on producers or importers of products that meet certain criteria for unhealthy food, for example, contain more than n grams of sugar per 100 milliliters of drink. This leads to an increase in the price of such products for the end consumer. Examples of countries where such taxes have been introduced or discussed: Great Britain, Mexico, France, Hungary, South Africa, several US states. The effects of these rules have varied, most notably changing consumer behavior. Research shows that such taxes can indeed reduce consumption of taxed products, especially among low-income groups. Also, manufacturers often change recipes, reducing sugar or fat content, so that their products are not subject to the tax or are taxed at a lower rate. But the tax has been criticized for the fact that it can disproportionately affect the poor, and for the government's nanny approach to citizens' choices. Although it is too early to judge the long-term effects, early data from Mexico and the UK show some reduction in consumption of sweetened drinks. A tax on singles was also adopted, and although such a direct tax in its pure form does not exist in the modern world, the idea of taxing bachelors or childless couples has historical roots and sometimes comes up in discussions. In the Roman Empire, there were laws that encouraged marriage and birth rates, and childless citizens, especially senators, could be subject to certain restrictions or even fines. The goal was demographic, to increase the number of people and citizens. In 1941, the USSR introduced a childlessness tax that lasted until the collapse of the Union. The goal was to stimulate the birth rate in the context of the post-war demographic crisis. Unmarried men between the ages of 20 and 50 and childless married women between the ages of 20 and 45 paid 6% of their salary. It is worth saying that today such ideas rarely emerge, and usually in the context of demographic problems or attempts to stimulate family values. However, they are extremely unpopular and are strongly criticized as discriminatory, violating a person's right to personal choice and potentially contributing to social pressure. In a modern democratic society, such taxes are unlikely. With the development of technology and the spread of robotics and artificial intelligence, a new, more futuristic, but already seriously discussed concept has emerged, namely a tax on robots or automation. The reasons for this were different, but the main one was the fear that automation would lead to massive job losses. A tax on robots could compensate the state for these losses, for example, by reducing income taxes or contributions to social funds from laid-off workers. The collected funds could go to retraining programs for people whose professions were automated, or to finance a universal basic income. But theoretically, such a tax could slightly slow down the pace of full automation, making human labor a little more competitive. I suggest hypothetically considering how all this could work. For example, a tax on the purchase of a robot. This could be a one-time tax upon the purchase of a robotic system. Robot tax is an annual tax on each robot used by a company. And automation profit tax is a special tax on additional profits generated by automation that replaces human labor. In fact, the idea of a tax on robots has caused heated debates. Some people, for example Bill Gates, see it as a way to fairly redistribute wealth and solve social problems related to unemployment. But there were opponents too. This is the majority of economists and business representatives, and they argue that such a tax could slow down technological progress, reduce the competitiveness of companies, lead to the transfer of production to countries without such a tax, and ultimately harm the economy without creating new jobs. They point out that robots often create new jobs in other sectors, i.e. the production of robots, their maintenance, programming. Despite the criticism, the debate about the robot tax is an indicator of how states and societies are trying to adapt to new challenges by using or thinking about fiscal instruments to manage social and economic change. And finally, we come to the last and most unusual tax, namely the air tax. This is the most metaphorical and bizarre of all, but nevertheless a real historical example that existed in some Chinese provinces during the Qing dynasty. Of course, it was not a tax on breathing or on the atmosphere in the usual sense. This air tax was essentially a tax on vacant land or habitable space that was not being used for farming or building. It was intended to encourage efficient use of land and prevent it from sitting idle, otherwise producing income. It was thus a way to tax the potential but unrealized benefit of owning property. It was sometimes interpreted as a tax on idle space or undeveloped lots in cities. It was intended to force landowners to either develop their lots or sell them to others willing to do so, in order to increase overall economic activity and the tax base. This tax, like all unusual taxes, was objectionable because it imposed a burden even on those who did not directly receive income from their land. However, its purpose was clear: to maximize the use of resources and to extract profit even from nothing, which recalls the famous phrase of Vespasian. So we have taken a fascinating journey through the pages of history and even looked into the future, exploring the most unusual taxes that have ever existed. From ancient Roman latrines to modern sugary drinks, from bricks to beards, the ingenuity of governments in finding sources of revenue knew no bounds. These examples show that taxes are not just a tool for filling the treasury, they are a mirror of their era and reflect various characteristics in themselves. For example, economic needs, the need for funds for wars, construction or maintenance of the state apparatus, social norms and cultural values. Taxes could be used to encourage or suppress certain customs, fashions, or ways of life. Also, taxes were often introduced to regulate the behavior of citizens, to stimulate the production of certain goods, like potatoes, or conversely to reduce the consumption of harmful ones, like sugar. And yet, the ability to collect a window tax depended on inspectors, and discussions about a tax on robots reflect modern technological challenges. The history of the window tax vividly demonstrated how fiscal policy can literally change the face of cities and affect public health. Gable showed how unfair taxation of vital goods can cause popular uprisings. And the urine tax is the quintessence of the pragmatism of rulers for whom money has no smell, regardless of its source. While many of these unusual taxes seem absurd today, their echoes can be seen in modern tax systems, which also seek not only to collect money, but also to influence society. Whether it is a tax on cigarettes or a tax on plastic bags, they all have the same goal: to change the behavior of citizens in the desired direction. Changes in the forms and objects of taxation occur constantly, adapting to new realities and challenges. This continuous evolution reflects the changing priorities of societies and economic landscapes. Despite these changes, the fundamental role of taxes remains the same. They are an integral part of human society. Taxes are more than just a means for governments to raise revenue. They are a powerful lens through which we can understand the values, concerns, and priorities of past and present civilizations. Historically, taxes have funded everything from ancient infrastructure projects to modern public services, shaping the development of nations and influencing social structures. The study of taxation offers a unique window into the economic philosophies and social contracts that underpin different eras. The adaptability of tax systems ensures their continued relevance, making their study a fascinating exploration of human ingenuity and the evolution of society.